one place it mentioned that rice would have a bracha of mezainos in another place, and the final bracha would be al hamichya. In another place, it said that the final bracha on rice would be a borei nefashos. So we had this contradiction. We want to say that it's the differences if it's Rabbi Gamliel or the rabbis. And the Gemara started off telling us that Rabbi Gamliel holds that after you have any of the 7 species, you have to recite the grace after meal. And the rabbis of course, don't agree with that. You don't say the grace after meal after the 7 species. What do you say? You say the al hamichya, the bracha that summarizes the grace after meal. So the Gemara then mentioned a story here, and the story was that the rabbis were all sitting around, and Rabbi Gamliel, they were eating dates, and Rabbi Gamliel told Rabbi Akiva, "Why don't you lead the grace?" So Rabbi Gamliel quickly said the summarized al hamichya bracha, the summary of the grace. And Rabbi Gamliel said, "Rabbi Akiva, why are you mixing in to the debate that I have with the other rabbis? You're mixing into this big debate. You should have done what I wanted you to do, and that is to say the grace after meals." And Rabbi Akiva answered him, and he said, "Well, I can't really just follow your view. Your view is an individual view, and we have to follow the majority. And so you taught me that I have to follow the majority. So, what are you expecting from me? You want me to follow your view and say the grace after meal? I have to follow the majority, and I'm following your teaching that we follow the majority. And so I'm not supposed to follow your specific view." Let me mute everyone here. So this is the beginning part of this brisa of seeing Rabbi Gamliel's view. Now, before we continue, I should mention, what is the bracha? So we're talking about the final bracha, the after bracha on the products of the 7 species. Now, the bracha, the after bracha on all other foods, after you drink something or after you eat a snack or other, the bracha besides for cake or cookies, but anything that's like that's not made from the 7 species. In other words, not grain and not from those fruits. The after blessing is a 1-line blessing, which we've discussed. It's a 1-line blessing. After anything from the 7 species, the bracha afterwards is like a nice long, it's a 1 big paragraph blessing. It's called al hamichya. Now, we also mentioned that the beginning bracha for cake and cookies, for anything made from grain, make it into flour, the beginning bracha is borei mine mezainos, who creates different types of mazain. Mazain means sustenance or nourishment, nutrition. Yes.
When you mention a bracha now, is it too difficult for you to give me the page in the siddur for that bracha?
Well, it depends what siddur. Hold up which siddur you have.
The blue.
With the English translation, the new siddur.
Yeah.
So I have to go get it, and I could tell you. But do you know where the grace after meal blessing is?
I don't know any of the blessings in the siddur, because they usually give you a Birkat Mazon little booklet.
You mean your wife? And what about at home?
No.
Your wife gives it to you?
No, in shul.
What about at home? The
At
grace
home,
after meal. You got to say it at home. It's not a shul blessing.
Rabbi, if I knew what page.
Let me get
There's a website, Rabbi. Before you
Just
go,
one second.
can I mention?
Yeah.
Kosher.com. Kosher.com has a list of all the berachot
Oh, okay.
for all the foods. Kosher.com.
Let
So, I
me-
mean, that's
I'm not going to go
simplified
there
way.
every time.
But just look after Shachris. Mr. Resnick, just look after Shachris. They always have
Everything is
benching right
after
after
Shachris?
Shachris.
Shachrit lechol.
tell you, I also have this siddur here.
Okay.
And the blessing, the grace after meal blessing is on page 90. And then after the grace after meal, which is about 10 pages, 6 pages, then you have the blessing after certain foods, which is this Al HaMichya blessing, and that's on page 96.
Okay.
Page 96 has the Al HaMichya or Al Ha'etz, Al HaGef, and that's for the 7 species. And then if you turn the page to page 97, you have the Beirei Nefashis, all other foods and drinks. So
Thank you.
So these are the blessings that we're dealing with. Now, the blessing on cake and cookies is basically a blessing for food from the 7 species, because that blessing is for wheat and barley and spelt and all the other. So they're all considered they're considered part of the 7 species. So the after blessing for that would be Al HaMichya. The after blessing for wine would be Al HaGefen v'Al Pri HaGefen. The after blessing for dates and grapes and pomegranates and figs and olives, the after blessing for that would be Al Ha'etz v'Al Pri Ha'etz. Again, these are all part of that Al HaMichya. It's that summarized grace after meal blessing. So, and that's on page 96 again. Now, what is the beginning bracha on wheat if a person were to eat like a kernel of wheat? So we said the beginning bracha would be Beirei Pri Ha'adama. Kaises es achita tzarech levarich aleha Beirei Pri Ha'adama. Person who chews on and eats a kernel of wheat would recite the Beirei Pri Ha'adama. Now this becomes very complicated, because what we're saying is really wheat should have a mezainos blessing, because it was given this special blessing before it, because it's a type of sustaining food. But if you're eating the wheat in its original form and you haven't made it into a cake or cookie or cracker, so you're eating it in its original form, it doesn't take on that special quality of being muzzing. And therefore, you would recite the typical blessing on herbage or vegetables or grain. You would basically Beirei Pri Ha'adama. So you're saying the beginning bracha Beirei Pri Ha'adama. Now, this is where it gets very surprising. What is the after bracha if you eat wheat in a not regular way? You're eating wheat kernels. What would the after blessing be on wheat kernels? Anyone know what the after blessing would be on wheat kernels? Again, if you were to say mezainos in the beginning, then the after blessing would be Al HaMichya. But here you're not saying mezainos in the beginning. You're eating them not as unique for what they are from the 7 species. You're reciting a bracha on them as any vegetable, because you're saying Beirei Pri Ha'adama. So what is the after blessing on that type of wheat?
Shackle.
No, the shackle is the beginning bracha. And that would be if you would eat flour, maybe.
Beirei Nefashot.
Okay, so Ezra says the bracha would be Beirei Nefashos. Why? It's from the grains. It's from the 7 species.
But it's only a kernel.
But you're not eating it in the way its regular form of eating. And it doesn't get that special blessing unless it was eaten in its regular form. And so, of course, eating an olive, you will recite the Al HaMichya, the Al Ha'etz after blessing, because that's the normal way to eat it. That's the way you eat olives, the way they're grown. But a grain, the proper way to eat it, the real way to eat it is after it's ground and made into flour and made into something that, spaghetti, or made into cake or cookies or whatever. crackers. So after
Rabbi.
that's the proper way to eat grain. And if you're eating it as a kernel, as Ezra says, the after blessing would be also not a unique after blessing. It would be bari nefashos. Now that is the common view of the sort of like the accepted way of doing things. However, it's important to note that not everyone was comfortable with that. Not all the commentaries in the Talmud. For example, there's a Tosfos over here, a very long Tosfos on the side, where he says, what would the after blessing be for a kernel? He talks about it right here in this long Tosfos over here on page 37a. And he mentions that for the after blessing, what would the proper wording be? So he wants to say it would be al hamichya, the al hamichya blessing, different than what Ezra just said, which Ezra is not wrong. It is the common accepted way of doing things. But again, we're going to discuss Tosfos's view here. And on the side, Tosfos over here mentions that he's wondering, yesh l'sapek, he says, I have a suffix, I'm not sure, what bracha you would recite after you eat a kernel, which is not the normal way of eating it. Would it take on the special blessing of the al hamichya because of it's one of the 7 species? And the Tosfos says in his question that maybe the end of this bracha should be al ho'adama ve'al pri ho'adama. So at the end of that long paragraph, which is a summary of the 3 blessings, the end of that paragraph, we always conclude for fruits, we would say al ha'aretz ve'al ha'peres for fruits. You would, at the end of that that blessing, you would say, we thank God, blessed are you, Hashem, for the land and for the fruits. Now, Tosfos wants to say, what would you do for a vegetable? So he wants to say, you would say, al ho'adama v'al pri ho'adama. That's how you would end it. And you would actually have a special ending for this blessing. And you wouldn't say the bari nefashos, you would say the long paragraph, which is the al hamichya grace, the al hamichya blessing. And initially, so this view is mentioned by Rabbeinu Tam. Again, this is Rabbeinu Tam, who in his machzor, in his siddur, he wrote this bracha, but then it says that he changed his mind afterwards. And the reason he changed his mind is because we don't find this bracha mentioned anywhere. And because we don't find this bracha mentioned anywhere, he says it must be, like Ezra said, that really it's the bari nefashos. But the conclusion of Tosfos is that he's really not, he doesn't want to take on, like, it's not so simple. Like, he doesn't want to say for sure. And therefore, the conclusion is that it's best to eat it during a meal.
Rabbi?
But it's definitely a thought. Tosfos brings this thought that there might be room to say a alternative wording at the end to include grain. That is the Tosfos's discussion here. Yes, Ben.
I wanted to know if you can give me what is the 3 brachot that you're talking about, and which bracha was the one that Rabbi Akiva did, the single.
Recording in progress.
Let me mute everyone.
I asked the rabbi, I didn't ask anybody else.
Okay, so the page 96 is this bracha that is for the 7 species, according to our halacha, according to the final halacha. That is on page 96 in your siddur. And that is a summary of the grace after meals. And this is the bracha that Rabbi Akiva recited after he ate dates. He recited this bracha. Rabbi Gamliel wanted him to recite the full grace after meal, which is on page 90. And it goes all the way till 96. But Rabbi Akiva did not do the full 6-page blessing of 3 brachas. He did the 1-page, the 1 paragraph bracha on page 96. And Rabbi Gamliel was insulted because he wanted that Rabbi Akiva would follow his view and do all the full grace after meal, which we call the 3 brachas. Okay, so I mentioned to you now that there is this question as to eating wheat in not the regular way. What would the after blessing be on that? And that is a very complicated issue, because keep in mind that a lot of the food we eat falls into that category. What do I mean? If you eat granola is not a cookie. It's not made into flour. It is pieces of oats. And the same thing would be a lot of cereals might fall into this category. Not Cheerios. Cheerios is made into like a cookie type of thing. It's ground into flour. But there are other types of cereals that are maybe even puffed wheat might be included, and it would be, I believe it would be ho'adama, the cereal of puffed wheat, and if so, what would be the after bracha? And the after bracha would be this would get you into this issue, because you're eating something from the 7 species, but it's not the normal way that the grains are meant to be eaten. And of course, if a person did eat it, we would follow what Ezra said, which would be bari nefashos, but that's not the preferable thing to do. It's preferable to eat it within a meal. And if you don't eat it within a meal, then you would follow what Ezra told us. But the preferable way would be to eat it within a meal, because some question if you should really be reciting a al hamichya type of bracha and end it al ho'adama, end it with al pri ho'adama, on fruits of the earth. The problem is we don't find that in the format, it's not familiar. We don't find it in the Talmud. We don't find this bracha mentioned in the Talmud. But I will tell you clearly, the Alter Rebbe wrote a summarized laws of the brachas, and in fact, many Siddurim have it in it. And if you look there, I don't know if any of you are familiar, it's called the Seder Birchas Hananin. And this is from the Alter Rebbe, who wrote, in addition to the Shulchan Aruch, he wrote a summarized version of these laws. And even though it looks like a nice thick book, but it's actually, it's only about 13 chapters. And this has English and other translations, but it's, but the brachas, if you look there in chapter 1, he brings down this Tosfos, and he says, some question what would be the after blessing. Would the after blessing be bari nefashos, or may ein shalosh, the summary of the summary of the grace after meal, which is that the one blessing summarizing the 3. And because of this suffix, we say you should not eat the measurement that would require an after blessing. Rather, you should eat it within a meal. Eat it within a meal or eat less than the amount that you would need to recite an after bracha. Now, if you ended up eating it not in a meal, you should say the bari nefashos. But this is the source of this issue. Again, we're dealing with an issue that's unclear because you're eating grain, but you're eating it not in the normal way. And therefore, the after blessing is questionable if it should get that special after blessing of the 7 species, or does it just get the generic after blessing called the bari nefashos? Yes, Ezra, you've been
Rabbi?
patiently waiting. No, Ezra has been patiently waiting. Yes, Ezra.
The question that I had, Rabbi, is you made a statement that granola should be a boy priyadama, but it's processed because the granolas that I eat have flavoring added, etc. And so therefore, in that case, shouldn't it be a boy mini mizonot because it is processed?
So it could, there are different opinions. I have to be honest with you. It's not a very simple thing, granola. There is a thought that maybe it should be mezainis or hoadama, but not because of being processed. But the fact is that the grain becomes attached to it's attached to other grains and to other pieces. In other words, it's granola are oats that are cut into they're cut into pieces, but they're not. It's not a flour, and it's not made like a dough. It's not made into a dough at all. And so on the one hand, it seems like it's just a grain. It's kernels. It happens to have some glue to it. In other words, it's glued together with some honey and sugar and other things. But the fact is that it's definitely different than like a cookie that's made into here in this Art Scroll book. He writes that if the particles do not adhere to each other, it's hoadama. If the particles adhere to one another, it would be mezainos. But that's not so simple. That's the way he writes. But I don't know if everyone would agree with that.
I'm looking at my program here that combines the law of Brochos by Rabbi Forst from Masorah,
that's
Feldheim Sefer, and an OU Sefer.
And
they say that wheat germ is Adama. But if it's cooked wheat germ, it's Mizonos. So now, similar to what you're saying, that if you're just chewing on wheat germ,
right,
you just make an Adama. If it's cooked and it's whatever, it becomes a Mizonos.
Now, just explain to me, is wheat germ like a cereal? What would someone eat? Wheat germ, is that a flour? Is that like flour, wheat germ? We can't hear you. You just
I guess. I don't know.
Wait, say that again.
It's not completely flour. It's still in its raw state before it can ground into flour.
So it's thicker, coarser.
It's slightly coarser than the oats than the actual oat. It's like it's on the next level, but it's not quite made into flour yet. It's not ground into flour.
Right. Because if it was made into flour, I would think it would be shahakol even. We learned already that if it's made into flour, it probably loses its grain status of being grain from the ground because you're ruining it by grinding it, unless you create something special from it, like a cake or a cookie or bread or other things that you sort of ruin it because you change it for the worse. Only if you end up fixing it will it get back a bracha, get a better bracha. But otherwise, it just goes down to in level to the shahakol, the more generic bracha. So the granola is not so simple. What
part of the wheat kernel, these delicious flakes include many nutrients like folates, vitamin E, and thiamine. You can add wheat germ while cooking hot cereal and baked goods. Sprinkle it on, or you could eat it raw.
Right. So what we're seeing here is that there's a lot of foods that we eat that we end up into questionable zone. we enter into a zone that's not so simple, because there are a lot of foods that are not cooked according to would not create a mezainis bracha, and because of that, it would be questionable what would be the after blessing on them.
Rabbi,
So, yes, Moshe.
buckwheat, you say ha'adama, it's already nefashot. Buckwheat is not a kind of a wheat, nor is it even one of the 5 principal species. It's a legume. Therefore, neither mezonot nor hamotzi can be set over a product. Yeah, but it's sort of
correct.
Yeah, it's.
You're correct. Moshe mentions a good point. A lot of people get confused. They think of kasha, which is buckwheat, and they think, oh, that must be a wheat. Oh, I can't eat more than a kazayas of it. If I eat more than an olive size, that might be a problem. That's not true. Buckwheat is not wheat. It's a different type of seed, and it's not one of the 5 grains. Buckwheat is not wheat. It's called buckwheat, but the bracha on it is ho'adama, and the after bracha is no question for sure boirei nefashis. It's not one of the species that Israel is blessed with, even though it's a Jewish food, and the after bracha is boirei nefashis. There's no question about it. We're dealing with only issues of the grains that are the 5 grains, and they are the after bracha of them should be al hamichya. It should be this paragraph that summarizes the 3 blessings, but because the grain is not cooked the appropriate way that we consider to be the norm, therefore it it possibly doesn't attain that status of getting that special bracha of the 7 species. So it ends up in question. We end up in question, and we try to not go into that area of question if possible. Of course, if there's nothing else to eat, then you rely on the boirei nefashis after blessing. But certain scenarios where you sort of can't control yourself. But it is better not to enter that zone. Okay. Any other questions here? Yes, Ben.
No, it's me. Yeah, I just want to ask in regard to barley, I often use that and just as a salad. So I do cook it, but you're basically eating the barley itself, and maybe I add things to it, or in cholent where you have barley as a main ingredient, or with other things.
So what we're entering is another challenging question, and I didn't really touch upon this so much, but we did learn that there was a brisa that said if you cut the wheat in half, or in thirds, or in fourths, or in fifths, or in sixths, and if you have rice, you remember that brisa? That in such a case, so we said this is maisa kadera. Maisa kadera means the typical like porridge type of mezainis, the way they would eat oatmeal in those days, the way they would eat porridge, and so the way which is the blessing of mezainis. This was the common way of eating it. It was either chilka, which means they would cut the wheat in half, targis, which is they cut it in 3 pieces, silas, zadrez, arson, and then it says oirez. Oirez means and rice. So it mentions all of these cases, and it says that is maisa kadera. That is real. That is mezainis, and
is that what you would say on cholent?
The point. So the question is, does it have to be divided in pieces in order to recite the mezainis bracha or not? That's really what the Gemara seems to be hinting, that it needs to be broken down in order to recite a mezainis. Now, I'm going to read for you this again, this is that book from the Alter Rebbe that in chapter 1, halacha 8, he says, you don't recite mezainos on grain and al hamichya unless you eat it in the normal form that it's eaten. For example, a tavshil that's made from kemach, a cooked dish made from flour, or the grain itself that's divided, listen to this carefully, divided into 2 or 3 pieces or more, and it's cooked with water or other liquids. So this is called daisa in all places. Or even if it wasn't divided, but the husk was removed, and that would be the custom to eat it that way in its form. For example, grits of barley. So that is one view, that to recite a mezainos, the special bracha, what is the normal way of eating these grains? That they have to either be divided up, or in other words, divided in half, cut in half, divided into 3, or more, or flour, if it's cut in flour. Or another example would be something that's usual to be eaten this way would be like grits of barley that they remove the outer shell. There's a shell that's removed, and that is the way that it's eaten. So that would be mezainos. But some say, no, that's not good enough. Only after it has been stuck together from a lot of cooking. But if it's whole, and if the kernel is whole, and they have not had their husks removed and have not been stuck together, you only recite a boirei pri ho'adama and a after bracha, which is the question we're not really sure, because Israel was not praised with this type of eating. So what we're saying is that the bracha mezainos, the beginning bracha, only gets that, you only get that beginning bracha of mezainos if it's eaten in a way that Israel is praised with, which means the normal way of eating it. And then in doing that, the question is, does the grain need to become cooked to the extent that it becomes like a mush together? It's stuck together through lengthy cooking, which maybe in a thick barley soup, maybe you would say that, but in a just cooking barley, or could be questionable, because you have this argument here. Does it have to be, how much cooking does it need in order to be considered the normal way of eating it, in the way the rabbis established that blessing? In other words, the rabbis instituted this blessing based on the normal way of eating it was. And there are 2 opinions here. Either it's enough that it's just divided in pieces and it's cooked, is that possibly good enough to give it the bracha of mezainos? Or another opinion is that they have to be pressed and stuck together. Yidabku hagarinim zelozeh. They're attached to each other from a lot of cooking. Now, why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because of 2 things. One is what Edith mentioned about barley. Barley becomes a big problem, eating a barley soup, because for 2 reasons. Number one, what is the beginning bracha on a barley, on barley? If it was really cooked and it's very thick, so it becomes like the barley is like one mass. It's all, one thick mass. Then it would seem like all opinions would agree that you could recite a mezainos on it. But if it's a typical thin soup that just has barley in it, So the barley has not cooked to the extent that it's dissolved and attached to each other. The pieces are attached to each other from a large amount of cooking. And in that case, you would have this argument, is the bracha mezainis or ha'adama? And the after bracha, you would have another question of what would the after bracha be? And so barley soup becomes a big problem. I'm sorry we're ruining everyone's enjoyment now in food, because you're going to learn that there's a number of situations where there are questions as to what the bracha will be. So Edith's situation where you're taking barley and putting it into salad, let's say. Now, I don't know if you're just throwing a few pieces of barley. I'm not really sure. On the one hand, we often say that something that's from the 5 grains, that becomes primary.
Yeah.
But there are exceptions to that rule. So it might be advisable not to do the barley option. That might be, maybe make barley into a dish. I don't know, because it seems to be a few issues with the barley option. Now, the other thing that I'm mentioning is what Isaac had mentioned about the granola, and I also brought it here about the fact that granola sometimes is attached. The pieces of oats are attached to other pieces of oats, so it becomes like, a number of pieces attached to each other. And according to the Art Scroll book, they want to say that would give it a mezainis category. I don't think the Alter Rebbe agrees with that. Now, there obviously are sources for that. We'll have to find it in the Mishnah Brura. But the Alter Rebbe seems to say it has to be cooked until it reaches that level. By joining together with honey, because the honey puts the granola together, that doesn't seem to give it. It wouldn't seem that would be enough to give it a mezainis bracha. If it was cooked together, that it caused the pieces to attach to each other, that would be a reason to give it a mezainis. But if it's just putting honey there and the honey is attaching it to other pieces, that is, according to the Alter Rebbe, not enough to give it the mezainis bracha. But it seems like they're following another opinion, and that would be enough to give it a mezainis, a granola. Now that's good. If you want to follow that, that's great, because then the after bracha for it would definitely be ala mechia. Then you wouldn't have any problem. But if you want to follow the Alter Rebbe's way, that creates a little more complicated issue, because it ends up that granola becomes you're limited to eating, when to eat granola, because it doesn't. It's a questionable after bracha on granola. The first bracha would seemingly be ha'adama, especially because it's not cooked. It's only steam. It's only it's roasted really. So it seems like it's in other words, in a certain sense, granola is somewhat more complicated than we think, because the general rules that we're talking about are more for cooking, and granola is more baked, and it's been discussed at length by the authorities as to if the bracha should be ha'adama. Very often they say ha'adama on granola, and according to that,
Rabbi,
you have a big question of what would be the after blessing, which, if you want to be strict, you would have to eat less than an olive size in order not to have a question of what the after blessing is. Because if you eat less than an olive size within 3-4 minutes or 6 minutes, if you eat less than that, then you don't have a problem, because you don't recite an after blessing. So every 4 minutes, or however strict you want to be, every 4 minutes, of the most strict view is 9 minutes. Every 9 minutes, eat less than an olive size, then you have no problem. You can make you recite your ha'adama, and your after blessing is not an issue. Yes, Moshe.
Rabbi, the amount of water that's in the granola bar, if it's more water than honey or brown sugar, that also has an important role, whether it's mezzanot.
We've made granola in my house, and we don't put any water. I don't think they put water in granola. It would ruin the texture, the crunch. It would ruin the crunch if you put water in it.
Right.
So there's
But
no water.
initially, there is a certain amount, I think there is a certain amount of water that's made a little bit in order just to make cohesion. But the most is the brown sugars and the sugar that's in it and the honey that's in it,
Yeah.
that makes it even more cohesive. But it puts it in a level where it's more mezzanone than it would be, you say hamotzi, or
Why would it be
if
more
it's just
mezonot
loose.
than ho'adama? Why would it be more mezonot than ho'adama?
Well, because it's more there's more cohesion. It's not loose. The oats are not loose.
Right. So it depends on which view you want to follow. Does it have to come? The cohesion has to come through cooking, or is it any way of cohesion? Is that good enough? You know what I mean? What we were reading here from the Alter Rebbe is it has to really come from cooking. It seems like, yes, but okay, yeah. Thanks for mentioning that, Moshe. Good point. Ben, yes, Ben.
Yeah, I wanted to say, as far as barley, in the cholent, it sticks together. But the reason it sticks together is from excess cooking or long cooking. That's what the Rebbe was talking about. That
So if you have a cholent, if you have a cholent,
but the actual sticking comes when the skin comes off, because I think the skin is like a celluloid. It's not going to stick to each other.
Mm-hmm.
So either the skin has to be removed, or through cooking it falls off or softens.
So you have to know that not everyone knows how to make such a good cholent, where the barley attaches, where it's not too much water. A lot of people make a watery cholent, and
only in shul they make a watery cholent.
So if it's watery, it becomes complicated. Here in the Art Scroll book, he says cholent without potatoes or meat. If it's just the barley, he wants to say it's mezainis and al hamichya. And if it has small pieces of potatoes or meat, also mezainis and al hamichya. With large pieces of potatoes, he says on the barley recite mezainis and al hamichya, and on the potatoes you recite ha'adama and bar nefashes. On large pieces of meat, on the barley you would say mezainis, and on the meat you would say the shahakol and bar nefashes. Now with beans, then he says, what about with kishka? So if it doesn't have kishka and it's just beans with no barley, so then you would recite ho'adama. But if it has kishka, you would say mezainis and al hamichya on the kishka, and on the cholent you would recite ho'adama. So they want to say that barley, basically they are lenient with regard to barley, and barley they want to say because it's a pearled barley. Pearled barley is sort of a little piece is taken out of the barley, and that piece that's taken out is the fiber. And nowadays, the companies may make a lot of money because they sell you barley, and you're really not getting barley. You're getting part of the barley. You're getting everything that's not so nutritious. And they remove the fiber and they sell it to they use it for something else and make more money on it. In the meantime, your barley there's a little piece missing from all the barley. It's called pearled barley. And that, some say, well, means it's broken. Means the barley has been cut into pieces. So if so, you could say mezainis. You could say a mezainis on it because it's like a cracked wheat in half. It's like cracked barley in pieces. So they want to rely on that, and based on that, they recite a mezainis. But it's one view to be lenient because it's pearled. It's not necessarily the accepted view according to everyone. Again, they're following that, and it makes life a little easier. And on barley soup, they would recite mezainis. What they write in this book, they write mezainis on barley soup. So, that's the way they write. Now they have a note in the back about the barley. And the note that they write is, They deal with barley soup that also has vegetables in it. It creates a little if it only has a little barley and a lot of soup, so creates a question of to maybe recite a bracha also on the soup. And so they tell you to recite the bracha on the soup first and then the barley second. So in other words, it's let's say it's not vegetable, it's just water. It's only a little barley in it. So then they tell you that maybe the barley is not exempt because it's so much soup there with only a little barley. But in any event, they want to say that barley would be a bracha of mezainos, and I think that's based on the fact that it's pearled barley, and not necessarily does everyone agree with that. So these are some of the questions that we are learning here, and they come up when you start dealing with the halachas of these foods. So and I do encourage you to look things up a little. Look up the bracha on granola. See, what about granola with milk? That's another issue. Does the fact that the milk connects the granola, would that be good enough? And you'll see different, you'll see what the Rabbi Google has to say. These are, you'll probably find a lot of different views in the, on the internet. The Sephardic rabbis might have their halacha, but these are definitely some issues. Again, cholent would be an issue with the barley. Barley is a question, barley soup. And this is all connected to our Gemara and our Tosfos. What is interesting is that brisa that we mentioned about the wheat that's broken in two or in 3 and 4, it then mentions and rice. Now it's interesting that it doesn't say rice that's cut into 2, into 3, into 4. It just mentions and oirez. This is exactly in the middle of page 37a, like right in the middle of the page, maybe a little closer to the top, but pretty much in the middle. Now, with rice, it ends up the fact that the brisa doesn't mention about it being cut in pieces gives more reason to say that rice doesn't need to be cut into pieces in order to give it its bracha of oirez, which officially is mezainos. And again, the source that it might not be need to be cut into pieces is this Gemara that it doesn't mention rice has to be cut into pieces. It only mentions wheat is cut into pieces. And this is Rabbeinu Yoina in the back of the Gemara. He is the source that says that rice does not include it in that rule. Rice doesn't have that rule, but other rabbis argue with it. So it ends up that rice is potentially more mezainos than barley or other grains that aren't broken up, because those grains that aren't broken up, the brisa clearly says those grains have to be broken into pieces in order to give them the mezainos category. But rice, it doesn't say that. So if you look in this book that I'm reading from called Seder Berchas Hanen, and it says rice, if you cook it until it becomes one mass, or you ground it and made from it bread, oirez, however you're going to translate oirez, but oirez would be mezainos. And the after bracha of oirez, which we'll see in our Gemara, is bari nefashos, is the bari nefashos. But the beginning bracha, that you cooked it, and of course that makes sense because our Gemara said we proved Rav and Shmuel wrong, and the bracha on oirez is mezainos, even though it's not from the 7 species, but the beginning bracha is mezainos, and the law in the rice, if it was cooked till it becomes one big mass, that would be the bracha mezainos. But some say even if it's not cooked to that extent, you would say mezainos. And the reason is, even if it's whole, even whole rice, you would say mezainos. What is the source of that? What do you mean? It's not broken into pieces. The grain wasn't broken into pieces. Then the answer is our Gemara, Rabbeinu Yoina's diuk, Rabbeinu Yoina's mentioning this point that oirez doesn't fall into the same rules as the other grains. Oirez, which we're translating as rice here, and it actually would not need to be, according to that opinion. Again, it ends up being an argument because other opinions disagree, but Rabbeinu Yonah says it doesn't need to be broken into pieces, and that's why many people will recite mezainos on rice. Now, the Lubavitch opinion about rice, we take into consideration the fact that we don't know what oirez really is, because Rashi here says oirez is not rice. Rashi says oirez is millet. So we take that into consideration and we say, you know what, rice, shahakol. We don't know. Is it mezainos? Is it ha'adama? So we say, of course, you should eat it in a meal, but if you don't, the only way to get around it is you would recite shahakol. But the rest of the world doesn't seem to follow that. They want to follow Tosfos only. They don't follow Rashi here. So again, in Lubavitch, we follow both. We're nervous, maybe Rashi, the opinion of Rashi, the opinion of Tosfos. The rest of the world seems to follow the logic of Tosfos, which fits with the modern way of calling it rice. And they also would recite the bracha of mezainos on rice, at least for the beginning bracha. And I'm not sure the Sephardic custom. Ezra, do you want to shed some light on that? Is the Sephardic say, do they also say mezainos on rice? Anyway, but the definitely the Ashkenazic custom is to say mezainos on rice, and they follow the Tosfos over here that we mentioned. Res means rice, and but I mentioned that Rashi disagrees, and therefore there's room to say that maybe rice of today, what we call rice, doesn't fall into that category, and maybe should be ho'adama, and therefore we'll say shahakol to fulfill all questions, or of course it's best to eat it within a meal. Okay, any questions over here? Yes, Susan.
Rabbi Nuri.
Oh. One second, I called on Susan. Susan?
Was rice actually available at the time of Moses and all of this history? Was rice?
Well, it definitely is in the Gemara. There's discussion.
But you're saying it's not. You don't know if it's translated as rice
referring
or
to
millet.
Yeah, but if you translate oirez as millet, then many would translate daichen as rice. But so it's not excluded in the Gemara, at least according to many translations of daichen. That would be rice.
All right, thank you.
So it was around in the time of the Gemara. Okay, Moshe, you wanted to say something, Moshe?
Yes, right. Mezanot is also said for puffed rice as well. Is that correct? For Borei Nefashot.
Puffed rice, that cereal that they, it would seem like that would be, correct. The correct bracha for puffed rice according to the Ashkenazic view. That's what it would seem.
Okay.
Now, interesting. I see in this Art Scroll book, they write brown rice. If the kernels are whole, they say ho'adama. On brown rice. But on white rice, they say whether or not kernels adhere one to another, it would be mezainos. Now that's something I'm going to have to figure out. Why would brown rice be worse than white rice? It seems like what they're saying is the brown rice, they say if they're partially disintegrated and softened, then they say you could say mezainos on brown rice. But if they're whole, you would say ha'adama. But if they're broke, so they want to, it seems like they're not following Rabbeinu Yonah. They want to say white rice. It seems like because they take out the bran from the rice and make it white rice. In other words, they're removing the brown part. So they're calling that cracked. And the fact that it's cracked, it gives it it would give it the bracha of mezainos. But if it was brown rice, you would need it to be partially disintegrated, in order to get the mezainis. That's a very interesting thing. I don't know if most Ashkenazic Jews are aware of that. That's from so they're following. They want to make sure you follow at least both views. In other words, they're fulfilling both of those views. The only thing they're not fulfilling is the fact that rice might not be rice. That's the other view, because oirez might not be rice, but they are fulfilling the fact that maybe it does need to be cracked or broken into pieces in order for it to have the mezainis bracha. Different than Rabbeinu Yoina, who seemed to be more lenient. Okay, let's see. We've got 2 minutes left. So the Gemara that we're on, we're really on page 37b, and let's see if we could just try to finish off over here this discussion. So where Rabbi Yehuda had mentioned sort of like a different version of this statement of Rabbi Gamliel. Initially, we just had Rabbi Gamliel and the rabbis discussing the bracha on the 7 species. And then and Rabbi Gamliel had a very extreme view. He said on any of the 7 species, you say grace after meal. Let me mute everyone. I hear some noise here. So you would say the grace after meal, and the rabbis argue. Now, the Gemara then says that Rabbi Yehuda says in his name that anything from the 7 species, and now we turn the page to 37b. Now, if it's not a grain, or if it is a grain, but you didn't make it into bread. So Rabbi Gamliel says you would say the regular 3 grace after meal, but the regular grace after meal. And the rabbis say that no, you don't say the grace after meal. You say the 1 paragraph summary of the grace after meal, called the alamichya. Now, then he says, what about if it's not from the 7 species, and it's not a type of grain? For example, bread of oirez and doichen. So in that scenario, Rabbi Gamliel says that the bracha on it would be, the final bracha, the after bracha would be the al hamichya. And the rabbis say no, nothing, which means the Borei Nefashos. So what we see from here is that Rabbi Gamliel holds that the after bracha for rice is al hamichya, and the after bracha, according to the rabbis for rice, is Borei Nefashos. And the Gemara wants to use this to explain a contradiction we had before, because before we had a contradiction where it said the after bracha on rice is al hamichya, and that didn't seem to fit with the rabbis. And so the Gemara explains, no, that's Rabbi Gamliel's view. That's Rabbi Gamliel's view, and that's why the bracha after rice is al hamichya, because that's Rabbi Gamliel's view. The Gemara now says that can't be. B'mai okimta, we're on 5 lines from the top. B'mai okimta Rabbi Gamliel. How could you explain it, Rabbi Gamliel? Ema seifa dereisha. Look at the end part of the beginning of that brisa. What did it say over there? Im eina prusois kayomais. If the pieces are not intact, in the beginning you say mezainis, in the end you say alamich. So we spoke about that the wheat that was cooked, it was first baked into bread, and then it was cooked. And we said it depends if it's kayamais, if they are intact or they're not intact. So the Gemara is asking, how could you say that that's Rabbi Mani? Who does that go like? Rabbi Gamliel, if you want to say it goes like Rabbi Gamliel, it can't be. Rabbi Gamliel says even on dates and on daisa, which is porridge, you say 3 brachos. So you have bread, it just doesn't happen to be intact. You think you're not going to say the 3 blessings, the grace? Elapshita Rabbanan, it must be the rabbis. That must be the rabbis' view that you would say an al hamichya. That must be the rabbis. So if so, we can't say that when it says on rice, you say al hamichya, it's the rabbis. If so, you're going to have a contradiction, the rabbis on the rabbis. Because again, we just proved that we can't explain a brisa to be Rabbi Gamliel's view. So it must be the rabbi's view. And if so, we have a contradiction in the rabbis. What is the after blessing on rice? So Rabbanon. Really, we have to say it's the rabbis, and that both of them are the rabbis' views. How could you have it? So we have to fix the brisa. And for rice, you have to fix it up. Don't say that you say an alamich. Must have been a mistake crept into the text, the Gemara says, and therefore the Gemara tells us that the text of the brisa should be that it's bari nefashis. So what's the conclusion of the Gemara is that on rice the after bracha would be bari nefashis. So the beginning bracha on oirez is alamichya, is mezainis. The after bracha is bari nefashis, and the only question is what is oirez, and that is what we discussed earlier. And of course, it depends on who you want to follow. Sei gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Stay safe, everybody.
Okay.